better than it was before, so that we feel at last that we know ourselves more clearly. That expresses the goal that I have and the relationship that I have with my artwork. From there, I'd like to introduce Tom DiMaria with Creative Growth Art Center, which is a nonprofit based in Oakland, California, that serves artists with disabilities by providing a professional studio environment for artistic development, gallery exhibition, and representation. Tom, I first met Tom a year ago at Nina Johnson Gallery, where he came to Miami to present the work of the artists at Creative Growth. So Tom, please tell us about Creative Growth.
Sure, thank you. I'm so happy to be invited to this, Tina. And hello, everyone. We're in Oakland, California, which is right across the bay from San Francisco in Northern California. First of all, I want to say that I am not an art therapist, and our program is not an art therapy program. So, but you'll see there's a lot of therapeutic benefit to the program I'm going to describe to you, but I just want to not confuse anyone that you don't engage in therapy without a therapeutic practice, and I don't have one. Creative Growth Art Center is an art center for people with disabilities that was founded, to our knowledge, as the first independent art and disability center in the world, founded in 1974. So if you think about 1974, this is a very radical idea at a time of social change in America, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, when hippies and social culture are changing, Berkeley free speech, summer of love. And at that same time, California is deinstitutionalizing people with disabilities who've grown up in these great, big, awful state hospitals. So artists came together and said, what are these people going to do who've lived their whole lives in these fortresses? And the decision was that art would be the path forward, that art would enable the person to express themselves, to empower themselves, to communicate with the public, and to really grow creatively. Our name, Creative Growth, sort of says what we try to do. So it started in our founder's home, like all the Bay Area companies like Apple started in a garage. We started in a garage with paint on a table. We now own a very large studio. We serve 160 artists with a variety of disabilities, primarily intellectual and developmental disabilities, in our program every week. You can come and stay your entire life. We're artist run. We support your creative activities. We don't teach in a traditional way. And from there, the program has just found its own course. We have several artists in the highest level of contemporary art in permanent collections in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and in San Francisco, Venice Biennale, huge gallery successes in New York, and in the NADA Art Fair in Miami, and other places you can come to see us. So that's the way of introduction. It's important to note on the disability part that creative growth development sort of precedes the passage of the American Disabilities Act in America. In 1974, the idea that people with disabilities could be not only integrated into society, but cultural leaders was truly radical. And thankfully, so much has changed since then. One of the important things, and I like your quote, Tina, one of the important things that we look for at Creative Growth is, the work that our artists make, and we support them as artists to find their own voice. And we want it to be from them. There's no right or wrong, and we're a supportive community where we just, allow people to be in that community for their whole life. And for people that have been marginalized in society, like most people with disabilities have been, to have a place that's theirs, that's non-judgmental, that provides as much time as they need, it's a really a privilege to be in that community, and the results can be seen in the art. It really wasn't until the early 90s when, with the passage of the American Disabilities Act, that people with disabilities were even sort of a class of people. The Civil Rights Acts in America in the 60s did not include people with disabilities. So the advancements that we've seen in the last few years are huge. And now we see this opportunity where people with disabilities are actually leading the culture. You know, one of our aesthetics is that, you know, the work should be handmade, not machine made, and that imperfection and the human voice and the human soul and the idea of experimentation is a vital, important part of the artistic process. And I think that our artists respond to that because often they don't, sometimes they don't verbalize. Sometimes they physically can't use parts of their body to create their work, or they've been told their whole life that they can't be productive or creative people. And for me, it's a fundamental human rights issue. The idea and the right to be creative and expressive and not be silenced is a vital human path to communication. And for people who communicate in a different way, it can be a really phenomenal way to connect human beings together. You know, sometimes I've heard people say, oh, I don't know how to speak with someone with a disability or an artist with a disability. Their work doesn't have an artist statement or the same intellectual kind of statement that I'd expect from an academically trained artist. And I like to say, well, you know, the information is there. You just may be looking for it in the wrong place or expect it to be presented to you in a way that is in some ways ableist because there's one way that you expect it to be communicated to. And that may not be how our artist sees the world or presents their work to you. You know, we relate a little bit to the idea of outsider art and self-taught art, if you've heard these expressions, because our artists come to us outside of a connectivity with art history, with the academic teachings of art. And we feel that that too brings a kind of fresh perspective and individual voice to what we do. We'll be doing another exhibition in Miami, in Nina Johnson Gallery in May, probably around May 16th. So you're invited to come and see that. That's where I met Tina, as she mentioned. And if you're in, you know, when things open up in the San Francisco Bay Area, or elsewhere and you're able to travel, you can come and meet the artists in the studio, and we have a gallery there as well. And that's a phenomenal experience to meet the artists and to watch their process in this great big room where 110 people work every day. And it's silent because everyone is so committed to the work. You know, that's a wonderful thing to behold. Last point on just a quick touch on COVID. We're not fully open right now. Our artists are working at home. Everyone is well. We're delivering art supplies to them and working online with them to maintain connectivity. And it's particularly poignant that how people that have been marginalized their whole life have finally found this great community. And yet they're sort of isolated from the home that they found. But the resilience is amazing. And I'm learning that, you know, people with disabilities have been often told to stay at home and be quiet their whole life. So they've adapted to being at home. But it's particularly poignant that they've lost the community. So we're hoping for that to come back soon. So thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Somebody is asking about the book. Again, it's Art as Therapy. And it's Alain de Botton, John Armstrong. Okay. I'd like to move next to our next panelist, Stephen Legari, Educational Programs Officer, Art Therapy, Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal. And the program there's so much going on at that museum. It's overwhelming. And that's why I'm so happy to have Stephen here really break it down and describe all the different programs they have going on there, including art, in particular, their art therapy and wellness initiatives. The Art Hive, which is a creative community studio supervised by an art therapist and a museum facilitator. The Atelier for Education and Art Therapy, which is a wide range of innovative projects designed for people with special needs. And also on their website, Stephen has shared a variety of art therapy workshops that you can do at home, with topics including the bridge, yellow, and the mandala. Also, Stephen has contributed to another book here on art therapy in museums and galleries. And I'd like to read a section that Stephen has contributed in the book. In the introduction, Entering the International Atelier for Education and Art Therapy at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, with more than 3,500 square meters dedicated to the activities of the Department for Education and Wellbeing. The Atelier is the largest of its kind in a museum setting in North America. There are 12 studios, 2 venues for exhibitions, a community open studio, a group dining area, and spaces to relax. This is also where the art therapy program is housed. The program includes various therapy groups, workshops, exhibitions, student placements, the Art Hive, several research partnerships, and a full-time art therapist in residence. It is the culmination of nearly 20 years of engaged community practice and stands as a bold response to a society's needs that are only growing in number and complexity. Stephen, I'm really excited to have you tell us more about all of the programs at your museum.
Tina, thank you for that. Was such a generous welcome. Thank you so much for welcoming me into the space, and good evening, everybody from Montreal, Canada. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. I'll dip into a couple of the things that we've been doing in our department as an illustration, because to give you a list doesn't really give you enough information about what a museum might be up to in terms of its social mission. So it has been about 20 years. You'll find this in a lot of museums and several galleries as well. Through the education departments, there's always an initiative where the educators are reaching out. They're trying to connect with local community. They're trying to connect with different organizations, special classrooms, clinics, and they work in collaboration to bring those groups into the museum and give them the rightful access that they have as well. And I just like to say in parentheses, Tom, it was really wonderful to hear about the work that you're doing. And while I am an art therapist, I am such a huge fan of all of the initiatives in the arts and well-being and health. I don't see it as a single approach. It's a pluralistic approach, and we need all of these approaches. Thank you for inspiring us with your work. In art therapy, we're doing group work. It makes the most sense in a museum environment. And art therapy was already described by Tina. Usually you're finding art therapists working in clinics, in schools, in private practice, in hospital, in community centers. But in a museum, we've got this amazing resource that we get to exploit called a collection. We get to use, and I say exploit in the very positive sense, we get to use the museum's galleries as a place to connect, not in an art historical way, but to invite people to project, reflect, jam with the art on the walls. We're doing that virtually now in our current format. And this really serves as an adjunct to our goals in art therapy, was to help people externalize, to help them connect through what is often very unnameable, people living with trauma, people that have been through medical distress, people that have certainly been marginalized, people living with different disabilities. The groups really multiply depending on the program. And Montreal being a huge metropolis and the major support in Canada. We also have an incredibly diverse population, and a lot of people need to learn French as their second language. So it's a destination for people to break down one of the cultural barriers involved in being a migrant to the city. The group that I did this afternoon was, for instance, in collaboration with an organization for restorative justice. People self-identify as victims in this group. Most of them have abused in their childhood. And we use about 3 different works from the collection to have a reflective discussion about the meanings of these works based around themes. We then make art together. I usually serve as a witnessing role, and then we offer a reflective process at the end. And the process is repeated sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a bi-weekly basis. It really depends on what our partner needs. And the partnership is the part that really needs to be underlined, because our partners in community are the experts working with their community. And so we, on the museum side, we try to build these partnerships so that people, when they arrive at the museum, have a sense of place, have a sense of ownership, and hopefully have some felt sense of safety. But ultimately, they also get to be empowered to say, this is what the future of this project should look like. I'd also just like to pay tribute to art therapists across the States, the UK, and other parts of the world that started doing this kind of work more than 20 years ago as well. Art therapists tried to find these interesting inroads through the education departments to pilot projects, working with different populations, different publics, and people with different needs. And as they did that, they created a model. And this model is something that I benefit from in having a very strange and interesting job as far as the fine arts world is concerned. So that's a kind of the art therapy program in a nutshell. I'd be happy to go into more details based on people's questions or people's interest. But I also just really want to illustrate that this is well, I have a very privileged and unique position as a full-time employee in a museum, that this work is being done across a lot of museums. I met with folks at the MoMA today. I met with folks at the museum, Dallas Museum of Art. There's something happening in all of our museums and in many of our galleries as well. And it's to be celebrated and also to be taken advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We did also, in our personal Zoom conversation, we talked a little bit about the difference between art therapy and wellness activities. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely. As a clinician, we're going to do those things that you might expect. We're going to talk about confidentiality. We're going to lay out a treatment plan. We're going to understand your expectations, your goals, your objectives related to your healthcare objectives, often based around a diagnosis, but not always. So art therapy is going to use a clinically informed frame, even when we're in a fine art museum. Wellness programming doesn't do evaluations, doesn't take into account diagnoses. It's mostly working to provide people with a holistic experience, in this case, in a museum setting, where they leave in a better mood than they arrived. I want to give them opportunities to encounter beauty, to encounter wonderment, to feel socially connected. Our goals are going to overlap all over the place. But part of the distinction is the detail that we go into in art therapy, and also that we're going to be often very problem-centric. We're going to give people the opportunity to explore the difficulties of their stories, of their past, of their present, and be able to hold that space for them as they're exploring it. Wellness programs are mostly focused on, let's say, positive outcomes, solutions focused, and general well-being.
Thank you. Okay. Now I'd like to introduce Lark Keeler, who is a specialist in mindful education, creativity exploration at the NSU Art Museum in Fort Lauderdale. One of NSU's Art Museum's most popular adult education programs, Creativity Exploration, promotes the development of creativity and self-expression through art making and the practice of mindfulness. Lark, I participated in one of your workshops, and I'd love for you to tell us more about your workshops and the methodology behind them.
Thank you so much for having me, Tina. What an awesome group of people to be here with. I appreciate it. And thank you, guests, for being here today. I wanted to just begin by asking you to take a breath, because maybe you haven't thought about that the whole day through, right? And it feels good. So just do it again and savor it. So for a very long time, I was trying to convince the museum to offer programming like this. And eventually the need was just so great that they were convinced they should. And I'm really thrilled to be offering this class now. We've been doing this for years, and we've migrated to be online. The program essentially looks like taking a look at a group of artists or an artist, a particular style, interesting materials, learning about them. But before we do any of that, starting class with a mindfulness exercise, using meditational pieces, mindfulness that might be guided, breathing techniques, body centering and grounding, thinking about visualizations and colors. There are so many different pathways to incorporate mindfulness into art making. And so for each class, I try to do something new. I find that there's not sort of a one size fits all for most things in life, including mindfulness. So it's nice to be able to offer different sorts of approaches to the participants that attend the class. If I have to think about the class and sort of the ultimate sort of goals and sort of the wonderful things that I'm seeing come out of the participants that are attending, you know, so many of them are working towards these ideas of navigating changes in their life that were big. So often I'll hear from people that are attending the class that they're moving through grief, or that they've had a life change, like all of a sudden they're an empty nester or retired. And so these big life changes are important moments and milestones in their life where they're sort of reevaluating who they are. And so it's interesting that they sort of come back to art, since I've always sort of seen art as their first written language. And so it's nice to see them circle back to the art making and sort of, like I said, savor in it. You know, when we think about sort of dropping in and getting into that flow state of art making, when we think about how art making connects our voice and our choice and gives us this real authentic space to be able to express our innermost feelings. When we think about how even with all of those sort of wonderful things bubbling forward, there's also this experience where you're beginning to even grow and develop and cultivate greater empathy and perspective and understanding of others. It's such a richness that's happening in that class space. And I think it's because, you know, of course, you know, mindfulness is a great wellness tool. It's healthy for a million reasons. But Drexel University has also finally proven what we all know, and that's that art makes us feel good too. It lowers the levels of cortisol in our blood, or the stress hormone, right? And so it's a natural partnership to have this mindfulness piece and art making coming together. I think that probably one of the things that's important to think about in the context, at least of the class I'm offering at NSU, Creativity Exploration, is that it's about more than healing, right? It's about maintaining wellness. And it's about this ongoing cycle of sort of restoration and renewal. And I wanted to be sure to mention that because it's not sort of like a one-stop shop, have some fun, you know, see you next year. I really am noticing that the people that are attending the class are people that are beginning to understand that investing these sorts of practices and habits into their lifestyle are really worth it for such a wide variety of reasons. So I couldn't be happier than to be the host of this class, because it's just as good for me to be hosting the class as it is for the people to be there. I also am a teacher full-time, and so I teach junior kindergarten through 5th grade. And so many of those practices I'm able to take into the classroom and then work with children, particularly in these days where everyone sort of seems to be grieving in one way or another, whether it's the loss of being able to play on the playground with my friends, or if it's someone near to you that's passed on. So I find that these practices are beautifully paired together like peanut butter and jelly. And I hope that you're able to come check out Creativity Exploration sometime. Right now we're a virtual community, and it really has truly become a community. And I'm excited about it. We also, throughout COVID, had the opportunity to post up some things called mindfulness modules, which are self-paced, self-guided sort of exercises that you can participate in that are published on our website. They're all featured around one of our pieces in our permanent collection. So it's a little bit about the artist, a little bit about you and this sort of journey of mindfulness, and then a prompt to make something that's a possibility in your home with ordinary sorts of materials that you'll have with you. So thank you so much, Tina, for having me. And it's been such an inspirational thing to hear everyone speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lark. And our final panelist is Maria Teresa Barbist, who's a resident artist at the Bakehouse Complex in Miami. And she has created a series called First Aid Kit for Artists. I'd love to have Maria talk a little bit more about this series and maybe fill us in on what's coming next.
Thanks so much, Tina, and thanks to everyone for being here today and about this, having this, for me, really important discussion about art and healing, and therapy and trauma. I want to give you a little bit background about myself. I'm originally from Austria, and I studied psychology and psychotherapy in Austria and was working as a therapist in a hospital in Innsbruck in the Tyrol. And then I was lucky enough that at a conference I encountered art therapy, and I had like this aha moment that was like, wow, that was kind of like missing, right, in my education. And I was trained in psychodrama, which is a group psychotherapy that is very much inspired by theater. So it's not that my education was not creative, but just like this, like art therapy opened like a completely new world for me. And I decided to go to California to study movement-based art therapy at the Tamalpa Institute. And so really bringing in the body into therapy and expressing myself through movement, creative writing, and also drawing was really opening so many doors for me into like resources that I didn't even know that I had. And that's actually how I ended up being an artist, because I did a training in art therapy. I decided to leave my job and go to the San Francisco Art Institute. And then I've been an artist since the last 10 years. But when the pandemic hit, I felt almost a little bit guilty, that I had all these resources and I discovered all these resources for myself and was using them for my own mental health and dealing with all my own personal trauma, but I was not sharing it, right? I was just like, kind of like, I know it. So, and I felt like, okay, I really want to offer something for my fellow artists, especially since I am in this amazing community at the Bakehouse Art Complex. And I came up with this workshop series, First Aid Kit for Artists, that I was actually not teaching myself or like sharing, kind of like talking about my own experiences, but I was bringing two artists together that were either thinking about working in mental health or in their practice, in their artistic practice, mental health played a role. And I brought two people together basically that worked in similar fields, and we did the workshop basically based on their practice. And the first workshop was two art therapists, very young artists and art therapists that shared their practice. And then we had two artists that were very much engaged in the community, African-American community, but also like activism. But also a friend of mine, Ashley Weish, who does costumes and dresses up as a Black superhero, incredibly empowering for the kids that see her in this, as a Black woman being a superhero is really awesome. And so, and the last one was about two artists that during the pandemic were trained as yoga teachers. And that was their kind of a way to, enhance their mental health and learn tools about, processing stress and sharing that with the community. So it was kind of a very eclectic way of talking about mental health. And I really wanted it to come from artists themselves. So it's not like someone from the outside or like a, psychologist, psychotherapist is telling them what to do. But I feel like so many artists already have a practice in their practice because of the art that they are making, and the personal expressions through their art have already a lot of tools, but usually don't maybe connect it as much yet, or don't see it as much as a coping strategy. And so that was really for me what I was hinting at in that, times of crisis, that I wanted for them to see and enhance the coping strategies that they already have been developing in their studios or in their practices. And Tina, that was it about the first aid kit for artists. And then Tina was also part of our series, the rocking chair sessions, which is also a project where we interview artists on a rocking chair. It's also almost therapeutic in this 50 minutes sitting on the rocking chair. That's another project that I've been doing for the last couple of years. And we have so far interviewed 150 South Florida based artists on a rocking chair, and are exhibiting the audio and some visuals also at the Coral Gables Museum at the moment. So that's also kind of like a little bit of, has some, therapeutic elements in there, talking about, childhood and how they came to be artists and what it means to them. And thank you so much, Tina, again.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of end the formal part of the panel with reading a line from another book. This one is Essential Art Therapy Exercises by Leah Guzman. I think this is a fairly new publication. And in the section on healthy healing place, it's incredibly important to have a safe, inviting space for art therapy sessions. And I was very interested to hear, or I am very interested to hear about how you, each of you, go about creating a safe space for your programs and your initiatives. People with disabilities and people with special needs are very often victims of bullying and harassment, and are very vulnerable. It's a very vulnerable population of people. Creating art in a group atmosphere, a group environment, which I experienced when I was in the hospital, allowing each person to express themselves as an individual. So I was wondering if you could talk about the idea of the safe space, or how you create these spaces, or how the people you work with, how you help them feel safe to get to that point where they can express themselves. Maybe Tom, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, a lot of our people, what they appreciate the most about the Creative Growth Studio is the sense of safety and community. And as you mentioned, so many of them have been denigrated or insulted or bullied their whole life, or dismissed, which is a kind of form of abuse as well. That coming together and being asked to participate, and I want to hear from you, and your opinion matters. And it takes people a while to understand that there's not going to be a judgment made about them, that there's no right or wrong, that the only thing we correct is if someone insults or causes harm to someone else. And if that happens, we use the lesson of, you know how that feels for you, and this is why we don't do that here. But it rarely happens because I think that everyone knows that pain coming into our program, and we're all searching for a place of community. And I think then we just have to, you know, reduce, be conscious of safety. Sometimes I think it's amazing to have 100 artists working in a space with a gallery with shared resources and staff that show their work, and some sell really well and some don't. And it's a very non-competitive space because it's the process of creation that unifies, that is calming, that is the common language, that is the unifying. And I think people are just hungry for safety. You know, as our artists advance and become leaders of our program, and as the idea of artists with disabilities becoming contemporary art leaders come to the forefront, there's important questions around what that leadership means. Creative growth artists like Dan Miller, for example, whose work is highly valued. He's in major collections around the world, museums and Venice Biennale. He earns a lot of money. He should have the opportunity that any artist has to have his own independent studio or work in a community like Creative Growth, and that space and that choice should be his. And hopefully, as you know, the world changes and understanding grows, he'll have more options for safety and support outside of our sort of cocoon space of privilege. So those are the questions that are in front of us too as we grow.
Stephen?
Thank you. I try to operate from a frame of safe enough space and try not to assume that safe space is something we ever arrive at. Safe space feels like something that's constantly sort of breaking down. We have to rebuild it together. I do a lot of checking on my privilege. I do not assume that I'm the therapist for everybody. I also want people to have the opportunities to anonymously feed back to my program and to the larger museum about their experiences, because there's always power differentials involved when you're the therapist and you've done all this work to invite people to your big fancy museum. They're going to be less likely to maybe make important criticisms about what didn't feel safe. And in a fine art museum, to assume that there's no such thing as neutrality. We could wander into a gallery exploring the natural world from the Romantic era, and it's all beautiful and lush, and we're surrounded by the natural world. And then we're going to take a turn into another gallery, and there could be highly provocative work that's going to trigger somebody. So staying attuned to what it is that is happening in the group from moment to moment is really essential. Not making assumptions about what feels safe, and asking a lot of questions back about what felt safe enough. But then just briefly, that you mentioned our open studio before. This is a network of community studios across North America and different parts of the world as well, called the Art Hives, arthives.org, if you want to put it in the chat. Started by Janice Timbotos, an art therapist who's originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and was working with homeless mentally ill artists. And in that space, we just practice radical hospitality, greet every single person, whether they're arriving for the first time or the 50th time, with the same sense of welcome, the same sense of sincerity, and the same sense of the desire to help them feel included as best as you can. And to do that repeatedly, because particularly people, I mean, to say people living with trauma is absurd, because we're all living with trauma, but some people in much more complex ways than I have ever experienced. And they have finely tuned senses to whether a space feels welcoming or not. And it's our burden, it's our responsibility to build that safe enoughness that they can find a seat at the table. And so that's how we work in the Art Hives, is really greeting people one at a time, one moment at a time, through the basic principles of kindness.
Thank you, Stephen. Lark?
Yeah, when I think about safe spaces, I love that Tom said that people are hungry for those sort of safe spaces, and they just don't seem to be in enough areas in the world quite yet. I think that I see it in my classroom with the littlest kids, and I see it when I'm working with elders. I think that it's a place of vulnerability, and respecting that it's a vulnerable space when we're expressing ourselves, whether with paint or our words, is very, very important. People need to feel supported, of course. People need to feel celebrated. I think, you know, as Stephen mentioned, you know, staying attuned and focusing your listening, being an active listener. And so I guess I'm kind of thinking about it as someone who does hold space. These are sort of some of the things I think that are really important, right? That I'm not trying to solve anyone's problems during that time, that it's just a space that they can express openly, and that the space is open to whatever does come forward and is allowed to come forward. I think that it's also really important to keep your own stories and issues with yourself, because the space is for them and you're the one that's holding it. But that does then mean that at the end of holding that space, there's some aftercare that you need to do for yourself, right? Because holding space it takes some strength, and it takes some training, and it takes a whole lot of practice. But speaking of practice, I think, you know, so oftentimes in art experiences and classes, there's a lot of sort of self-consciousness about what people are making, and they might be kind of like looking at others or not, you know, kind of hiding their expressions. And I've gotten into the very important habit of letting my youngest students know to my elders that we're practicing artists, and we're practicing right now, and this art is for no one but you, and that's enough. And so in our spaces, I think reiterating that, making sure that they understand that this is a place of exploration and discovery. It's a place to play, because we don't get to do that enough. And I think, yeah, people are really hungry for that. Thanks, Tina.
Okay. And Maria.
So the first Aid Kit for Artists is a Zoom-based program, right? Because it was started in the pandemic, or it is right now. Hopefully it can change at some point. To turn Zoom into a safe space is challenging. I think what Stephen said before, it's about transparency, like saying what is going on, like if something is recorded or not recorded, if a Zoom room is closed, or, you know, if you have to register beforehand, or how many people are going to be in the room, et cetera, et cetera. I think those are important components. And we decided to, it depended on the theme. Like the first workshop was really based on art therapy, and we wanted it to be a, you know, safer space. So we reduced the number of people. We did not record it. We did not live stream it on Facebook or anything, you know, and the others were more open. And then for rocking chair sessions, it is a rocking chair, right? A safe space for many, but it is also a podcast. So artists are really telling their life stories and sharing it. So what we are doing to create a safe space for that is that we are giving the artists also the control on the finished product. So if there is something that they want cut out, or otherwise we're keeping the whole 50 minutes as a whole story, basically. But I think it has to do with transparency and with control, if a space is safe or not.
And also your program, your rocking chair sessions, that's held at the Bakehouse Art Complex, because I know when you invited me to come and talk with you, it was in your studio space.
Yeah.
And there were other artists working on their artwork in their own spaces.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was already a more public, you know, it was not like an office of an art therapist. It was already more public. So it was not creating as much an illusion of it being like a therapeutic space, right? It's like, it's a studio space. Yeah. But in the I feel like in the conversation, often we we were able to create that safe space just in, you know, in kind of like sharing experiences, right? So that for me often feels like a big gift, you know, that when an artist is able to share like important moments in their lives and in their education or in their practice.
Wonderful. I think I would like to use the remainder of our time to open it up to some questions. And Jody, you've been monitoring the chat. Were there any questions that have come up?
I have 3. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that our director is on the Zoom. So our director, Phyllis Korab, is here. So welcome to Phyllis. And I hope you can hear me. I'm getting as close as I can to the mic. One of them was, what do sessions look like in an art museum? And I'm not sure who asked that one. That's one question. The second one is, can you
well,
let
okay.
me do all 3 because
okay.
I don't want to lose anybody. Can you post prompts on the website? And I'm not sure what they meant by that, but I'd be happy to post something if it's sent to me. And the third one is, which art materials does a person use to better express themselves? Is it clay, acrylic, or collage, or etc.? So I can repeat those, but those are the 3 questions that I've been monitoring.
Does anyone want to jump in?
Can I just jump in on that last one, Tina? Because it just sparked so many ideas in my head. So sometimes you need to pound some clay, and sometimes you need to be dainty with a watercolor brush. And I think the great thing about art making is that you've got a million different vehicles that you can choose to drive, right? And they'll get you there. So I think that that's making many materials available to someone who is needing to sort of discover what their jam might be is a good idea. And there are times when scribbling is just all that needs to be. So a crayon does the trick, right?
And if I can add to that, there are different, working with people with disabilities, there are different tactile and visual sort of prompts that are important for the person. Our studio is set up by media, and the person moves to the media doesn't work with the person. So we help them try to, we allow them to try to find their own path. Putting your hands into wet clay may be really stress releasing for somebody and be a bad experience for someone else. Fiber, for example, touching yarn and string and that kind of stuff can have a very meditative, soothing kind of quality for some people. Of course, our artists who are blind have a very different sort of, connectivity to tactile work as well. So there's no right or wrong. It's like find what feels right for you.
I also feel like that some materials are more evocative, like for example, like more emotional. For me, it is painting, and others like photography or film allow you a little bit more distance and are more like I don't know, more cognitive, maybe stimulating. So I do feel like for me, every medium has like has a different feel to it, like, or how in relationship to mental health, how deep you're going into a theme, or how further from the surface you're looking at a theme, for example.
I can quickly answer the sessions question. A session at the museum looks like a group of 8 people coming, them being warmly welcomed. We do a check-in, we do a visit that's been pre-planned, but we also allow for a lot of spontaneity. As been described by the other panelists, we offer a cornucopia of materials for people to choose from. They do so intuitively. They make what they need to make that day, and then we come back together in a circle to have a reflective process. I'd also, lightning round, I'd like to address Trixie's question, which is the critical pedagogies in the creative arts therapies is a huge issue. People of color and people with different abilities are underrepresented across the board. Fortunately, there have been writers, Art Therapy and Social Justice is a really important book that's come out. And in every university, there are now BIPOC circles that are created for students who have finally found community within these practices. And I won't provide a list of the ways that we support those students, but we certainly do our best to do that.
And if I can add to that, we have a very diverse artist population, and we do work all the time in terms of sort of breaking down stereotypes. There is not one kind of disability. People with disabilities can have bias against other kinds of disability. There is not one kind of person. And sometimes we get comfortable with our biases, even though we've been, a victim of discrimination. So I think always opening our eyes to a broad experiential reality and growing all the time in terms of diversity and understanding difference is a very important part to building safety.
Mm-hmm. Jody, any other questions?
There are two more questions. One is kind of timely. How are any or all of you increasing racial and ethnic diversity in art therapy or your practice? And there's one more question after that, but I'll let you answer that one.
I was actually jumping ahead to that question when I was providing my lightning answer.
Yeah,
I
was just going to say, Stephen.
I think Tom was addressing it too. Yeah.
The question. Okay, and the other.
I'd be happy to talk about that question too a little bit, because maybe answers one that we didn't get to before, which was about art prompts posted somewhere, maybe was a question. There are mindfulness modules on NSU Art Museum's webpage. And if you go into virtual, you'll see those mindfulness guided exercises, and they're by artists. They're influenced and inspired by artists that are in our collection. I think all of those artists are artists of color, actually, that I authored those on. And I think that that's sort of what I'm doing as an art educator in the world, is being certain to be including perspectives from all sorts of folks, so that we really have a colorful lens that we're looking through when we're showing artists' work. For example, this next workshop that I'm hosting is going to prominently feature Ruth Asawa's work, who is a Japanese American. Her work is beautiful and eloquent and gorgeous. And I just finished reading a book all about her, and I was sort of stunned about the Japanese internment camps and how little I had been taught about them in school. And in a book club, we discussed that and talked about it, and we were just like, wow, can you believe how little we knew about this? So I think it's the educator's job, the facilitator's job, when they can, to sort of be sure to share those perspectives and enhance sort of the things that we grew up learning that maybe we didn't learn enough about. So it's something really on the radar, particularly of art educators at this time.
Also, in terms of like prompts, Stephen, you have an art therapy section on your museum website. I mentioned that briefly in your introduction.
Yes, Tina, there's a number of capsules available on the website, sort of art therapy at home, well-being at home. They're nice pauses in the day. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The website was posted earlier in the chat if anybody wants to check.
And also, again, in this book, it's just filled with exercises and prompts, essential art therapy exercises. Jody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I have one more question.
Okay.
What was the biggest challenge to starting your art therapy practice?
I can provide a short answer in the domain of art therapy, in that it's a fairly unknown practice. So being in the constant position of being both educator and therapist, of informing folks on what art therapy is, it's certainly, even with a job in a museum, continues to be one of the bigger challenges, is just letting people know that it exists and that it's a different way.
Anybody else? Okay.
Any other questions, Tina?
Okay.
So it's
okay.
8:02. I want to thank everybody. This was an excellent panel. We had excellent questions. We had a wonderful evening. I thank you all so much. And Tina, go ahead. You can take it from here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for participating, for being open to engage with me and with the program and with the audience. I really do hope that this is a starting point for continuing our conversations and collaborating. I am hopeful that when we have the video, the recording, and we make that available, that we can share that with the arts community in our own geographical locations, and really try to press upon the people that make up our communities in the arts, that this is an area worth exploring, because it is an area that is growing, not just in terms of offerings, but also the need. Oftentimes people don't realize that art is a coping skill, and I didn't realize it in the very beginning when I was exposed to art as an undergrad, but at some point early on, I realized that it was becoming my coping skill. And then as I had an unbearable illness and found myself in the hospital, I'm so grateful that they did have an art therapy program. And I want to share that. So because it gave me hope, and it also gave me a sense of purpose. So with that, I think we will say goodnight, and thank you very much again. And I hope to see all of you in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.